We're speaking with Kenya Evelyn, breaking news reporter for Guardian US, and you had another article that you wrote very recently about Virginia passing the Crown Act. Can you tell us about that bill, what it was aiming to do?
Sure. Well, the Crown Act is one of 5 states that, Virginia's Crown Act is the 5th state that has essentially passed legislation that makes it illegal for an employer or a public entity, including schools, to target and essentially persecute or provide punitive outcomes for Black Americans disproportionately who wear hairstyles that, like mine, essentially revolve around their hair growing naturally as it does from their heads. It goes in a coil or a kink form and not down and straight. And oftentimes what gets overlooked is how discriminatory our labor laws are, that you can be fired or you can have your employment offer rescinded for refusing to cut your dreadlocks. You can be a young man in this country or a young woman in this country who's told you cannot walk across your graduation stage because you have an afro or because you have braids. These are aspects of Black American lifestyle and culture that are staple to us. It would be braids, it could be dreadlocks, it could be curls, it could be a large fro, or it could even be like mine, short curly hair, where because of just naturally of the way it grows, Black Americans have been targeted for that. And for what the Crown Act looked to do, first in California in 2019 was this legislation passed preventing this discrimination, and then essentially the momentum picked up. And as we recently saw with the 1-year anniversary of the passage of this legislation in California, several other states have since jumped on board. We've seen New York, New Jersey, Colorado, and Virginia also passing similar legislation. And so the effort around Crown Day is to, one, get people to recognize those very discriminative measures that exist for just everyday Black Americans living their lives. And then in the process to raise awareness with similar legislations in other states to dial back some of those legal parameters that make it essentially par for the course for people to be fired for doing something like I did, not either cutting their dreadlocks or not.
Yeah, and it's great to see so many other states taking this up and considering it, and hopefully with pressure they'll actually pass it. I feel like I can sort of guess at the bigoted motivation behind this discrimination. I'm curious publicly, what's the rationale for allowing it? Like, why is it still possible in so many parts of the country, and why was it possible basically universally for so long? Like, the people who wanted to maintain that system where you can tell people what kind of hair they can have and whether they could lose jobs for that, what's their excuse that they provide?
Well, it's a matter of professionalism, and that just speaks to the pervasiveness of white supremacy and Eurocentric standards of beauty, and that hairstyles that are more commonly associated with Black Americans, or simply because your hair, like most people of African descent, because your hair grows out or up or grows in a coil and not down and straight, that somehow means that your hair is considered less professional. It's less manageable. There's connotations of wild and unruly, and that plays into essentially how communities of people are seen. And so in efforts to what we call taming hair, we're essentially taming these communities. We're making communities of people where their cultural aspects, their cultural outliers and identifiers are repressed and oppressed and forced into these Eurocentric standards of professionalism or beauty, where like many of the young men I talked to in Richmond, Virginia, when we did this story, who may have had dreadlocks or braids, they talked about how one of the first instances any young Black man knows that if you're looking to find a job, you're not going to be considered as professional, even though you may be more degreed and more experienced. So one of the first things they do is head to the barber. And so this is one of those, this is what we see managers, this is what we see professional environments do. They intend to limit either their makeup of people of color on their staff overall by creating these tight parameters in which you can exist freely as a Black person in their professional environment.
And I know that in the article you talk about that this sort of discrimination goes back, as far as you can look. This has effectively been the norm.
Absolutely, we saw even in the late 1700s where Black women in Louisiana were barred from showing their hair. It was legally banned for Black women to show their hair, and they were forced to wear scarves or other type of head wraps. And so even as we saw, Black Americans, even in times of oppression, are going to find joy, are going to find beauty, even in our oppression. And so among Black women, even in Louisiana at that time, it became part in terms of fitting around this ban. They developed develop very elaborate head wrapping styles, many of which we see today that are also instances that employers, the military, and even other institutions have explicitly banned in the past. But we see those are being dialed back. We saw natural hairstyles in the military were lifted in all 5 branches in 2017, including dreadlocks. And we're seeing those efforts taking place in the civilian world as well, in terms of people challenging what is essentially considered professional.
Yeah. Well, it's a great write-up. Everyone should read the article for both the history and a possible look at where it's going. It does seem like there's some change, but when you put it in the historical context that you do in your article, boy, does it seem like it took a very, 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 very long time. But Kenya, Evelyn, we appreciate you joining us on the show and breaking down both of these very important issues for us.
Thank you very much for having me. Always a pleasure.
Check out the Damage Report podcast each day, wherever you get your podcasts, whether Pocket Casts or Stitcher or iTunes. You can join me as I give you the news and stories you want, with a range of co-hosts and interview guests jumping in on the fun each day. Again, that's the Damage Report, wherever you get your podcasts. And if you get them at iTunes, don't forget to rate and review. Sometimes I'll read them live on the show.